Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Our parsha this week is Ki Tavo. And you can see the symbolism there. The first fruits of figs. And today we continue our personal journey through the month of Elul as we prepare for the High Holy Days. And today is Elul 21. And in the circumstances that came out this time, it also corresponds with our September calendar date, which is the 21st of September. And so what we see is that Elul is now just 8 days away. And we are continuing to examine our hearts, and we're continuing to pray so that we will not only be spiritually prepared personally, but also spiritually prepared as a congregation for Adonai's plans for us. And he has plans for us. So pray for a spiritual breakthrough, not only for Beit Shalom, but also for our fellow congregations in Messianic Judaism. And we join our hearts together in prayer for the salvation of all Israel. But at the same time, our prayer is also for unity in the whole body of Messiah, all of Yeshua's followers worldwide. And it's time for both of these things to happen. It's time for Yeshua's body to come into unity. The time is near for the salvation of all Israel and the return of Yeshua. I'm excited about it. And as I look around the world, I think a lot of other people are too. Well, as we just read during the Torah service, Ki Tavo begins by speaking about bringing the Bikurim offering, the first fruits offering of the crops of the land, which would take place after the people had entered the land of Israel. And so these verses in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 10, which we read in our Torah service, are speaking specifically about the first fruits offering required by Torah. Now today, some followers of Yeshua give first fruits offerings. And that's okay. It's better than okay. But be aware that it is not a Torah requirement to give first fruits offerings today. So when a first fruits offering is given today, it comes completely from the heart of the giver, because there is no Torah obligation to give a first fruits offering today. And it's not something that you should worry about if you haven't given first fruits offerings. Why is that? Well, to begin with, it was an agricultural offering and not a monetary offering. And second, it was only to be given in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. But today we welcome first fruits offerings from those who choose to give them. If it's in your heart to give a first fruits offering, it is just that, an offering. So give as Adonai prompts you. The title of our message today is Ma'aser V'Sadaka, the tithe and offering. As we read a little further in chapter 26 of Deuteronomy, we find a reference to the Ma'aser, the tithe. And in this particular case, it is a tithe given to in the third year. When you finish tithing the full tenth of your produce in the third year, the year of the tithe, you are to give it to the Levite, to the outsider, to the orphan, and to the widow, so that they may eat within your town gates and be satisfied. Now, if you just read this, alone, right where it is, without having some surrounding understanding, this is confusing. But we're going to clarify what all this is about in just a few moments. I begin our message about tithing today by saying that tithing is very important, and it is sometimes a neglected part of Messianic faith. Even though we have good scriptural reasons to tithe, many of Yeshua's followers of today resent giving. I would not say that about you, because your hearts are toward the Lord with that regard. But tithing is a heart thing. We give from our hearts. But the good news is, for those who may resent giving, when they understand Adonai's purpose for the tithe, and also our obligation to Him, their hearts can soften. And then there are those who want to tithe, but they can't because of financial pressures. So since our Parsha has mentioned tithing, and we are in the month of Elul, today is a very good time to speak about this subject. So as we begin to consider tithes and offerings, we must first understand that everything belongs to God. Everything we own is His. Behold, to Adonai your God belong the heavens and the highest of heavens, the earth and all that is in it. He created it, and it's all His. All the tithe of the land, whether from the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, belongs to Adonai, for it is holy to Adonai. So we see that the tithe is also His. When we give the tithe, we are giving it to Him. But He also determines who is to receive it. In ancient Israel, when there was a tabernacle, and later on when there was a temple, also back then when we had Kohanim and we had Levites, Adonai gave detailed instructions as to how the tithe was to be distributed. Well, we are not under that system today. But still, we should understand what was required under Torah and what was required under temple law. Even though those laws are no longer a requirement for us, we need to develop the mindset today that everything which we think of as ours belongs to Adonai. How many times do we do that? But we do. We need to stop and think. Everything I have is a blessing that comes from Him. Everything which each of us possesses is His. But He has given us authority to be administrators, to be stewards over it. And how we manage His money is important. In tabernacle and temple days, under Adonai's Torah directory, how Israel was to tithe was described in detail. All tithing was based upon a 7-year cycle. I think all of you know that. We've talked about it in past years. This 7-year period included 6 years of tithing, which ended with the 7th year of release from tithing, the year that was called the Shemitah year, release. Then additional 7-year periods led up to the 50th year, the Yovel, the Jubilee. So what we see here is that tithes were taken in the first 6 years, but there was no tithe in the 7th year, the Shemitah, the year of release. And then another 7-year cycle would occur, and another, until the 49th was reached. And then the next year was the Yovel, the Jubilee. What most people don't realize about Adonai's system is that there was not just one tithe, but 3 tithes. The first tithe was called Ma'aser Rishon. That's what it means, first tithe. This was an agricultural tithe, and it was given to the Levites. You can read about that in Numbers 18:21. The Levites were the administrators of the tithe. And you know, when I read that, that was somewhat surprising to me, because I would have thought that the Lord would have let the Kohanim be the administrators of the tithe. But it was the Levites, not the Kohanim. This tithe, the first tithe, was taken in each of the 6 years. The Levites got this first tithe for themselves. It was what they lived on. But from this tithe, they also were to give 1/10 of their tenth, an amount which was called the Terumat HaMa'aser, 1/10 of a tenth, to the Kohanim, to the priests. So that part of it was for them. The Terumat HaMa'aser, 1/10 of a tenth, doesn't really seem like a lot for the Kohanim, but they were very well cared for by Adonai. And that was because they also received 10 different types of food offerings which were brought into the temple, offerings which they were required to consume there. They had to eat them there. But then they also received 10 other types of offerings which were brought to the temple that they could take home. So we see that the priests were very well cared for. As we proceed, you will see that Adonai looked out for everyone. But what we see here in this first tithe is that the other 9/10 went to the Levites. But we would have to consider that were a whole lot more of the Levites than there were of the Kohanim. Now, these tithes that were being brought were agricultural tithes, and the people tithed their 5 different kinds of grain which they grew, the wine which they made, their olive oil, their fruit, and their cattle. You can read about that in Leviticus 27:30-33. Then there was the Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe. And you find that in Deuteronomy 14, Deuteronomy 12, and Deuteronomy 26. This second tithe was a tithe required by Adonai, but the Israelites got to spend it on themselves. That's the kind of tithe we like, isn't it? But there was a catch. They could only spend it in Jerusalem. So this is the way that it worked. After the first tithe was taken each year, another 10th, the second tithe, was immediately taken from your agricultural products. And this tithe was to be carried to Jerusalem, where you and your family would eat and drink it during the festivals. But the second tithe was only taken in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years, 4 years out of the 6. But if a person was unable to store all of this food and drink until they traveled to Jerusalem, they were allowed to convert it to money, and then they could take that to Jerusalem to buy food and drink during the festivals. And we have the third tithe. The third tithe was the Ma'aser Ani, what was called the poor tithe. It was taken in the same way as the second tithe was taken. That is, it was taken immediately after the first tithe was taken, but it was only taken in the 3rd and 6th years. This sounds complicated, but I'm going to give you a little breakdown in a minute, and it'll help you to understand it. As the name indicates, it was given to the poor. And what this really means is that Adonai's plan for the Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe given by each person, was to be shared with the poor 2 years out of 6. You tithed it for yourself to take to Jerusalem in the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years, and you tithed it for the poor in the 3rd and 6th years. So that kind of cryptic verse which we read a moment ago from Deuteronomy, we can now understand it by understanding the system of tithes. The Lord said, when you finish tithing the full tenth of your produce in the 3rd year, the year of the tithe, you are to give it to the Levite, to the outsider, to the orphan, and to the widow, so that they may eat within your town gates and be satisfied. And what that is about, that is the Ma'aser Ani, the poor tithe. But it also had another name. It was known as the tithe of the 3rd year. And that's what this verse was referring to in Deuteronomy. Well, here's what the whole system looked like. The first tithe, the Ma'aser Rishon, was taken each year for 6 years. The second tithe, Ma'aser Sheni, was taken in the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years. And the poor tithe, Ma'aser Ani, was taken in the 3rd and 6th years. And that amounts to 20% per year for each of those 6 years. Now we also have the Bikurim. There are various estimates as to the percentage that the Bikurim, the first fruits offering, would have amounted to. One that I have selected is that it was about 4% per year in each of the 6 years. So summing this up, for 6 years out of 7, the Israelite paid the equivalent of 24% in tithes each year. It's amazing, isn't it? So with 10%, we think we have it hard. But the good news that we're not under that system today. We don't have to tithe 24% a year. But it was definitely required back then. And Malachi was Adonai's instrument to call to account those who were not being obedient to the tithe. He said, will a man rob God? For you are robbing me, but you say, how have we robbed you? In the tithe and the offering. You have been cursed with the curse, yet you keep robbing me, the whole nation. Bring the whole tithe, all 24% of it, into the storehouse. Then there will be food in my house. Now test me in this, says Adonai Sabaoth, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out blessings for you until no one is without enough. I will rebuke the devouring pest for you, so it will not destroy the fruit of your land, nor will your vine be barren in the field. Adonai Sabaoth says. So through Malachi, and you remember where Malachi was, a time that was about 400 years before the first century and the coming of Yeshua. Adonai was condemning the whole nation of Israel because they were not bringing the tithes which he commanded. They were not being faithful to bring the Bikurim, the Ma'aser Rishon, the Ma'aser Sheni, and the Ma'aser Ani. And that's what Malachi was referring to. They were violating Torah. But how many times have you heard these verses used when tithes and offerings were being taken up? It does not apply today. And we are not required to give tithes as prescribed in Torah. And as we've said already, there are several very obvious reasons for this. Specifically, there is no system to receive them today. There's no temple. There are no Levites to receive tithes. And for us, we're not in the land of Israel. But that does not mean that we can breathe a sigh of relief, believing that there is no tithe today, or for that matter, that there is no offering today. Now you know about the skeptic. The skeptic says there is no direct mention of the tithe in the Gospels. Have you ever heard that? And that is true. But there are many things commanded for us in Torah which are not repeated in the Ketuvim Shlichim, the writings of Yeshua's disciples. However, whether or not the tithe is mentioned in the later writings is not the test of us who follow Torah. The principle of tithing is given to us in Torah, and it was in effect in Yeshua's day. He rebuked certain Pharisees about the tithe when he said, "Woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites! You tithe mint and dill and cumin, yet you have neglected the weightier matters of Torah, justice and mercy and faithfulness. It is necessary to do these things without neglecting the others, without neglecting tithing or without neglecting justice or mercy." So what we know is that in the first century, tithing was being done. But these particular Pharisees had manipulated it to suit their own theological leanings. And now we understand that Yeshua's words to those Pharisees echo Malachi's words when Malachi said, "Will a man rob God? For you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In the tithe and the offering." Not only were they neglecting their tithes, but also their offerings. Offerings both then and today are important because they reveal the heart of the one who gives above what is expected. Offerings show compassion for special needs and for individuals. Yaakov, Yeshua's brother, and Shaul and the other disciples give us a great example of this. Realizing the favor that had been given to me, Jacob and Peter and John, who are the recognized pillars, shook hands in partnership with Barnabas and me so that we would go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. They asked only that we remember the poor, something I also was eager to do. So remembering the poor is the giving of tzedakah, an offering given from the heart. We read from Matthew chapter 6 today. In this chapter, almost all of Yeshua's teaching was about giving. To the people that were listening to him when he spoke these words, it was understood that they were to tithe. That had not changed in any way. For the obedient ones who were listening to Yeshua, Torah was being followed, and they were tithing the 24% per year, which we mentioned earlier. Have you ever thought about that? That was in the background. They were tithing. But Yeshua was stressing generosity. Generosity which could only come from a circumcised heart. And I think we need to understand that a circumcised heart does not only mean that one is saved. It also has to do with mercy toward others and our faithfulness in the walk to which Yeshua called us. Yeshua began by saying, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before others to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you do tzedakah, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, so that they may be glorified by men. Amen, I tell you, they have their reward in full. But when you do tzedakah, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your tzedakah may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret shall reward you." We all know what the word tzedakah means. It means righteousness. But it was also a euphemism for charitable giving, a way of referring to giving to the poor. And in these verses, that's what Yeshua was talking about, offerings for the poor. Now, how tzedakah is to be given has been misinterpreted by some, believing that no one should be aware of any gift which they give. But in these verses, Yeshua was not talking about the giving of tithes. In that day, tzedakah was giving to the poor. The tithe was already set, and it had nothing to do with offerings. Today, here particularly, we sometimes refer to our tithes and offerings together as tzedakah. But it was not that way back then. Yeshua's primary point in saying that tzedakah, that is charitable giving to the poor, should be given anonymously was so that the person receiving it would not be humiliated. Tzedakah given specifically for an individual through an organization or a congregation does not have to be anonymous. If you do it that way, what Yeshua was speaking about will not be violated. What he meant was that tzedakah is to be given with humility and in a way that will not embarrass the recipient. Also, don't forget that he said when you give tzedakah, not if. He expects that out of the goodness of our hearts, we will give offerings in addition to our tithe when we are able and led by the Ruach. Yeshua continued, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." But we understand what his message is here. His specific message in these verses is about the misuse of mammon, about the misuse of money. But it's also about the generosity of the heart. If we value money more than the value of the kingdom of God, we may be in danger of being hard-hearted, and the circumcision of our heart may be in question. These verses also tell us that the giving of a generous heart is recognized by Adonai in heaven. But there's a beware here. We must beware not to give in order to get, or because we seek recognition from Yeshua and the Father. And I would say, don't listen to those who promise you a blessing if you give. Adonai desires all our giving to be from the generosity of our hearts. The theme of generosity is continued in the next verses. The eye is the lamp of the body. Therefore, if your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or he will stick by one and look down on the other. You cannot serve God and money. You know what? The understanding of these two verses was one of the most exciting things which I learned 35 years ago when I began my Messianic journey quest. I was on a journey and I didn't know a whole lot at that time. But this was explained in the book, Understanding the Difficult Words of Jesus, a book by David Bidden and Roy Blizzard. And through them, I discovered that many of the puzzling phrases in the King James Version were actually Hebrew idioms. They were just colloquial sayings which everyone in that day would have understood. But somehow, over time, the meaning was lost. Look at those verses. The eye, in this case, represents the heart. And a person having a good eye is a person with a generous heart. A bad eye represents a stingy person, one who does not have a generous heart. Now, not having all this understanding in past years, you can imagine all the different ways that preachers have interpreted these words from the King James Version. Have you ever heard a sermon on these verses? I've heard several. Here's what it says in the King James. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in thee be darkness, how great is that darkness? Who knew what a single eye or an evil eye meant? The preachers did. Now we know. But it's also interesting that this idiom is still in use in Israel today. So when you are there and someone asks you for tzedakah towards some need and says to give with a good eye, you'll understand what they're saying. Yeshua concludes these verses with, you cannot serve God and money. If our life focus is on getting wealth and keeping it, money is our master. But if God is our master, if Yeshua is our master, our focus is on serving Him in the way which He directs. And serving Him should be our heart's desire. But even if we do not have a temple today, even if we do not have a storehouse, we do not have Levites or Kohanim, we do have an example regarding tithing in Torah. And it's through Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham. When he was in the presence of Melchizedek, the Kohen of El Elyon, the Most High God, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. In the example of our ancestor Abraham, the man of faith, we can make an example of what is called Kal V'Homer, the Hebrew teaching form, which is called light and heavy. And it goes this way. If Abraham gave a tenth of everything to Melchizedek, a human priest, then how much more should we give a tenth to Yeshua HaMashiach, Son of God, and Kohen HaGadol, our great high priest? That's our example. But our message today about tithing and giving is not about seeking more for Beit Shalom. It's about the month of Elul, and it's about our hearts. how we respond to Adonai with regard to giving is most definitely an important part of our walk. And it's something which we should also examine during this time. If we have been lax in the area of giving, it's time to make that a part of our introspection, our looking inward at our own heart. I especially want to point out that this message was not given to bring condemnation on anyone regarding tithing, and especially not on those who, because of their financial situation, cannot tithe. We all sometimes go through difficult times, and we have to make adjustments. And this message is to encourage those who are having financial difficulty. Start where you are and give what you can. Give what you can out of your heart, and then wait upon Adonai. That is the outworking of the emunah, the faith which we have expressed as faithfulness. As David said, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So at this time in human history, we who are Yeshua's followers are becoming more and more excited about his return. This generation has seen more fulfilled prophecies pointing toward his return than any other. We don't exactly know when it will be, but according to the signs of the times and the prophecies which have been fulfilled, our hearts tell us that we are in the period which the rabbis call Hatkalat HaGeulah, the beginning of the redemption. In Jewish understanding, Geulah, redemption, is the coming of Mashiach. But the rabbis have also described another period of time which they call Ikvot Mashiach. It is even closer to Messiah's return, and it is described as the time immediately before he comes. May it be soon. And in that same regard, we are also in anticipation of the coming high holy days, and the hope that this will be the time for the redemption of all Israel. Adonai has promised and will keep his word. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer shall come out of Zion. He shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom.